Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something pretty fascinating. We are going to unpack a highly critical, politically charged segment from Sky News Australia regarding the Albanese government's economic and tax policies. Now, our goal here isn't to agree or disagree with what's being said. Instead, we're going to neutrally dissect their argument piece by piece to understand exactly how they construct their case against the government's fiscal agenda. All right, let's just dive right in. We begin with the dramatic core accusation made right at the top of the segment. The commentators frame their entire critique around this concept of intergenerational fairness. They argue that fairness is really about giving the next generation a chance to work, get ahead, and actually see their hard work pay off. But the critics forcefully claim the current government is doing the exact opposite. They accuse them of pulling the ladder of opportunity up before young Australians can even get their first foot on the rung. Wow, right? It's a really powerful visual metaphor, and it sets the stage for everything that follows. So, to evaluate this critique neutrally, we're going to break the interview down into 4 logical themes. First, the spending addiction accusation. Second, taxes, housing, and ambition. Third, a question of political trust. And finally, the trillion-dollar debt burden. Let's start with theme number 1, the spending addiction accusation. The critics here really don't hold back. They use these vivid, almost satirical metaphors, claiming the administration has a flat-out spending addiction. And how are they paying for it? Well, the commentators argue the government is constantly shoving its hand down the back pocket of everyday Australians. You can feel the visceral reaction they're going for, right? Their fundamental argument is that potential changes to tax policies aren't just minor administrative tweaks. They are actively punishing success and crushing any ambition to get ahead. I mean, they pose this really pointed rhetorical question. How do you motivate anyone to work hard when, at the end of the day, the government is just going to come after their earnings? Moving right along to theme 2, taxes, housing, and ambition. So, a huge part of the segment focuses on housing. The commentators actually claim the government is operating under a false flag. Basically, this idea that adding more taxes will somehow magically lead to building new homes. But the critics map out a totally different trajectory. They argue that data increasingly shows that proposed changes to negative gearing, that tax break for property investors taking a loss, will simply scare off investment in housing. And the domino effect of that? According to the segment, less investment directly leads to higher rent prices. So the argument here is that a policy supposedly marketed as helping everyday Australians will in fact just make the cost of living worse for renters. Now, let's pivot slightly to the broader business community. The commentators introduce this really interesting concept they call founder flight. They're warning that changes to the capital gains tax are going to cause self-starters and job creators to basically pack up and leave Australia, or at the very least, take their money offshore. They're viewing the capital gains tax not as a way to raise revenue, but as a core incentive for people to build things. You take away that incentive, they argue, and you drive the wealth creators away. Simple as that. And to really hammer this point home, the segment brings in warnings straight from the tech and finance sectors. Get this. They argue that under the proposed changes, these businesses could face an applied tax rate of up to 47% on business equity. 47%! That is nearly half the equity value. The logic presented here is that a rate that staggeringly high completely destroys the drive for top talent to risk it all on a startup when they could just take a safe salary job. The critics don't just call this bad policy, they explicitly label it the corrosion and erosion of the foundations of Australia's future economy. Which brings us to our third theme, a question of political trust. To build this case about broken trust, the critics focus on a very specific number, 50. According to the Sky News segment, before the election, the Prime Minister explicitly stated 50 separate times that he wouldn't make these tax changes. 50 times! They highlight this to argue that citizens went to the ballot box voting for a very specific agenda. People believed they were electing a safe pair of hands, as the commentators call it, and now, midterm, the rules are being drastically rewritten. And this comparison right here really captures the whiplash they're trying to highlight. On one side, you've got those firm pre-election promises. On the other side, you have Treasurer Jim Chalmers' midterm, stating his job is to explain why the government has come to a different view. Well, for the critics on Sky News, that is utterly unacceptable. They argue that if a government wants to make changes this massive, they need to take it to an election first rather than just springing them on the public midterm. Their conclusion is forceful. These are simply not the taxes Australians voted for. And to capitalize on this alleged deception, the segment points out that this anger is getting organized. They bring up a brand new campaign website, notthethax.com.au. Its whole purpose? To harvest the stories of citizens who feel totally deceived by the government's shifting agenda. The commentators argue that it doesn't matter what focus group research the Treasury uses or what smooth lines he delivers, it just won't matter. They frame this as a fundamental breach of trust with the community. The big question they pose is, if the government breaks its word here, how can voters trust them on anything else, including protecting the family home?
All right, let's move into our fourth and final theme, the trillion-dollar debt burden. Now, the government might talk a lot about intergenerational equity to justify its policies, but the commentators completely flip that script. They warn that the true issue of intergenerational equity is the fact that the Commonwealth is barreling towards a massive $1 trillion in public debt. $1 trillion. They argue that squabbling over tax adjustments is totally missing the forest for the trees when there is a staggering, historic mountain of debt waiting for the next generation to deal with.
So the crucial point is how the critics draw a direct, undeniable line between today's government borrowing and the inevitable financial burden being dumped on the youth. They sum it up elegantly and honestly pretty ruthlessly like this. Today's debt is tomorrow's taxes. The commentators want to make it absolutely clear that public borrowing isn't free money. It is a delayed tax hike on people who may not even be old enough to vote yet.
According to the analysis in the interview, this creates a really vicious economic cycle. First up, the government borrows from the future to fund its spending addiction today. Second, pumping all that money in actively stokes inflation right now, making the cost of living harder for everybody. And third, the next generation is left holding the bag. They're the ones who'll have to service the interest on that debt and eventually repay the principal. The commentators do not mince words here. Passing the buck like this so we can live better today, they explicitly label it as intergenerational theft.
And that brings us to the end. We've seen exactly how these critics construct their argument, from claims of a spending addiction and founder flight to a perceived breach of trust and the looming shadow of $1 trillion debt. Now, we leave it to you to weigh the merits of these arguments for yourself. But it definitely leaves us with a heavy question to ponder. At what point does funding today's society cross the line into compromising tomorrow's prosperity? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep looking closely at the arguments shaping our world.